Hello, welcome to a channel about dark humor, life, pain, suffering, and ultimately about finding peace and acceptance of yourself. On this channel, I intend to post videos about my life and those close to me. I'm sure I'll stray a bit from that plan as time goes on, and that's okay. Why am I making this channel and these videos? Because therapy is too expensive. Everyone deserves to find somewhere to get the darkness out of their heart, soul, and mind. This is one avenue I've chosen to pursue for this purpose. I hope this channel stays up and unfiltered. It's a powerful thing when a mind is stripped of the natural filter we all blanket our thoughts and emotions with. It can be a dangerous thing too if the mind isn't focused to some purpose, a decent purpose. I know all too well the pain and suffering that can be inflicted upon oneself and those closest to you if the filter comes down. It's not to say that I am a mean or bad person, but I've come to accept that a great part of my mind is drenched in darkness and hatred. This is not to say this is not the way I want to be. As I was not born to hate life, but to find love, peace, and purpose in life. This is the true meaning of life for all people on this earth. Every single person's path is unique to themselves, and there's no end to the varied stories that have led people to where they are at this precise moment. But please know that for whatever reason, you found yourself exactly where you need to be at this moment. This moment might find you at peace with yourself, with love all around you, and a divine purpose in life that gives you great meaning and enjoyment. This moment could also find you in great suffering, a feeling of terror and horror encompassing your every waking and sleeping moment. You may or may not even be able to understand why you feel this way. I know that for a long time I was lost in a pit of self-hatred, fear, anger, and soul-crushing sense of loss and abandonment. I longed for the release from my suffering. I fantasized about the end of my existence. I became convinced that life was utterly and without meaning and worth, and that I too had no purpose and worth in this world. That if I became undone, then maybe I could finally impart some goodwill to this earth by ceasing to be. That isn't the truth, though. Every life has meaning, even if we may ourselves never understand how we matter. There's no magical guarantee that we will find and understand our purpose in life. It is sadly true that it's possible to go from the cradle to the grave without ever truly finding ourselves. I don't speak this way to instill dread or fear in anyone. I speak this truth for those who are lost and do not see a way past the darkness that shrouds their mind and sight. I want all people to know you have worth for this world. I cannot guarantee you will understand it when it is found. Your purpose might forever remain hidden behind your veil of understanding. But please, do not be afraid to wake up each and every day and search. It is truly the journey of self-discovery that allows us to begin to know ourselves. There's not always a magical, instantaneous moment where we understand our purpose in life. The search helps us to find the purpose, though, and grow to understand and accept ourselves. Who am I, some may wonder. I'll try to answer that question without becoming too long-winded, but I cannot make any promises. I'm not prepared to share my name, but you can call me JBE. This channel is about the life of JBE forever. No, I will not tell you the truth of what JBE stands for. If you need an answer, then it's simple. Jews buttfuck everyone forever. Now, before I get attacked for making a comment about Jews, know that I hold no ill will towards any of the Jewish faith. It's just a joke I told some guys once upon a time in an online game when they asked about my gamer tag and what the initials stood for. For me, the funniest part is that they believe me. I'm someone who loves comedy, though. True comedy is unfiltered and raw, with no subject off limits. Sometimes comedy is light and easygoing. Other times it will be like a sucker punch to the gut. I practice all types, but I specialize in dark humor. It helps me cope with the horrors that play in my mind on repeat. It allows me an escape, however fleeting, from the soul-sucking darkness I carry with me. I will eventually share details of the pain I carry in the form of stories and jokes, and I'll try to do so as delicately as my mental anguish allows me to. The purpose of this channel isn't to hurt anyone after all. All people have meaning and worth. It's not my place to hurt people to make up for the pain I feel. But pain is universal. We all experience it. We all experience it in similar and unique ways. Talking about the pain I carry helps me. Joking about it helps me. I can feel a deep, heartfelt connection to a person who expresses shock and anguish when I tell them the stories of my past. I find a resemblance of peace in the pain that the other person experiences, not because I get my jollies off on seeing others in pain, but it lets me know that if my story causes pain in another person, it's okay that I hurt, and I hurt a lot. Every moment is like a razor slicing through my mind, exposing long lost and forgotten horrors. So who am I? I am a human. I feel love, pain, joy, peace, shock, sorrow, regret, and hope. I'm not much different than most others in this world, but I am unique, just like everyone else. There's a sense of belonging and wanting in that thought. We all want to be unique, but we all want to belong to the collective that is the human race. We all hurt. There's no inherent guarantee of peace and joy in life, but there is and always will be the universal truth of pain. It can be depressing to consider this truth, and I struggled a long time to come to terms with this reality and find some kind of meaning to it. But there is meaning to the pain. It is a common bond that unites all people together. It does not matter what race you are, man, woman, child, straight, gay, bi, trans, nothing matters. Only that you're a human. To suffer is to be human. Do not fear this truth, but embrace it, and remember that even in your darkest, most hurtful moment of existence, you are bound to all other humans in this unique and universal truth. You have value, you have worth, you are worthy of existing. Who am I? I am a survivor. Every day on this earth there has been some assault or attack on my very being, but I am still here. The simple act of breathing is slowly causing the oxidation of my body and slowly ending my existence. But without that very oxygen to sustain the machine that is my body, I would not even be aware of this fragile existence we enjoy. Do not despair at this reality, but take comfort in this truth. Who am I? From the earliest moments of my memory, I was a victim. From the age of 2, the earliest I can recall, I was assaulted by my family. I was violated and tortured. The tender instincts of my infantile brain turned against me for a tool of sexual pleasure from my mother and my second oldest sister. I am the youngest child of my mother, the second youngest of my father, though we do not talk about my half-sister, unseen for 30 years. I was physically and sexually assaulted for most of my youth. At the age of 10, a stranger saw the vulnerability in my eyes and took advantage of me in his dark basement. I suffered horrendous night terrors without known cause, on and off for most of my life. It was very bad until I was around 13 years old. I suffered these terrors almost nightly in my youth, waking and screaming, running around my house uncontrollably. My family would corner me and try to talk sense to me. I would just scream terror in their face. My mother would try to calm me down, whispering softly, "Shh, baby, it's okay, it's okay. Shh, baby. Nobody's gonna hurt you." These attempts to soothe me often resulted in the night terrors growing in strength, sometimes resulting in violent outbursts from me. I would not understand where the outbursts came from until I was nearly 40 years old. I was physically abused by my 3 other siblings, 2 older sisters, and 1 older brother for most of my youth. My mother would regularly beat on all of us when she would come home from work exhausted, find the house slightly untidy, and proceed to destroy the whole house. She's especially fond of taking all the drawers in the kitchen and dumping them onto the floor and making us clean up after her. I grew up in this environment, as my parents had divorced when I was perhaps a year old. My father couldn't deal with the violent, jealous outbursts from my mother and withdrew into himself to avoid the pain. He moved across the city, eventually moving entirely out of the state. Every time my father would find a new woman to bring into his life when he lived near, my mother would unleash chaos and destruction down upon my father and the new woman. I remember once taking a great liking to a woman that was in his life, a beautiful, kind, blonde woman who had an equally kind son named Damien. I began to call her my second mom. My father never told me what happened, but I know my mother intervened and destroyed that relationship too. She took away from him and me a kind soul who just wanted to love us. My mother was a tortured soul, could not deal with her own demons and brutalized those closest to her to cope. I try not to hate her for it though. If I let myself hate her, then I must hate myself too. I too became an abuser as I grew older, and I cannot afford to hate myself anymore for the trauma I inflicted upon the world. To continue to exist, I have to love myself and accept who I am. But who I was does not get to define who I will become. It is possible to heal from trauma, even the foulest and sickest of horrors a mother in this world can inflict upon you. Believe me, I know all too well. I had to develop a code word for the horror that surfaced to describe the suffering I experienced at the memory of the sexual abuse I endured for years. Sour grapes. It's in reference to the flavor of gum I was rewarded with after enduring the sexual abuse and the promise to keep quiet. I haven't had to use it much recently, and for that, I am thankful. The memory still surfaces, but it does not break me anymore. I am a survivor. We are all survivors of this world. Who am I? I am an abuser as well as a victim. When I was 12, I touched someone else a fair bit younger than myself. I was broken, but even in the tortured state I existed, I knew it was not okay. I think sometimes about that person, and I feel immense sadness at the giggles and innocent eyes when I touch them. I'm not a monster though, even though the act was monstrous. Often abusers are themselves victims. The cycle is vicious and can inflict itself upon countless souls. I know someone did something at some point to my mother to help turn her into the person she was. So too did something happen to my sister, who's barely 4 years older than myself. I just pray and hope that the person I violated found peace and salvation, instead of a dark unknown dread pressed down upon their soul that they cannot comprehend. Memory is difficult to understand. It is imperfect. We are prone to misremember details of the events that happen to us. To cope with my own trauma, I suppress the memories of the sexual abuse. I think it ended when I was around 4 or 5 for my mother, and when I was around 10 for my sister. I still always remember the physical abuse though, because it lasted until I was around 13 years old. As you age, it becomes harder and harder to suppress memories. I can still remember at one point when I was a young child praying and begging God to take my existence and end it. That if he or she truly existed, they would end my horrific suffering and free me from my tormentors. It was around the time that I stopped trying to turn to God for peace. I never stopped believing in God, but I'd live a very long time before I could accept that God was not a sadistic bastard for making me endure all the pain and suffering I have. I still sometimes wonder though. The violence from my family ended after I turned 13 because I got into a fairly explosive fight with my mother and second oldest sister. It ended after I struck back out at my mother, and I found myself locked up in the local juvenile detention center. This episode ended with me in a hospital for treatment of my violent outbursts. It was in this place that I was finally able to begin to confront my demons and start finding a sense of peace. This is the place where I finally was able to begin to break through my suppressed memories and face the reality of my life. It was here that I realized I had been abused by my neighbor when I was 10 years old. It was also where I finally began to understand that my sister had abused me as well. I wouldn't be able to break through my broken memory enough to find the truth of the trauma I endured as a child until I was nearly a 40-year-old man. My family believed me when I told them about my neighbor, but I was told that I was mistaken about the abuse my sister put me through, that it was all imagined, and I was confused. I wished for a long time that my mother was right, that it was all a figment of my imagination from the trauma my neighbor had put me through. But, even in my shattered state, I knew the truth of what my sister had done to me. It created a great deal of resentment for me towards my mother and my family that I was not believed. I don't know why my mother refused to believe me. Perhaps she did, but was fearful that her own abuse towards me might come to light and embarrass her. I've tried to talk with my mother about these issues in recent memory, but she throws up her wall and refuses to listen or believe me. All the same, I am a survivor, and I will fix myself. I've had various episodes in my life where I've bottomed out and watched through my actions and those around me the dissolution of the life I knew to be. These experiences have always been extremely difficult and fairly traumatic. However, I would sift through the pieces of my life and try to find a resolution and path forward. Often these experiences helped me to break through the mental blocks I'd put into my head to protect me from the trauma of my youth. I think, that I had broken through these barriers much earlier in my life. Perhaps I could be much further along in my mental recovery had I realized these truths entirely when I was 13. But that's not how things played out. I would break through a mental block of memories, confront the realities of that situation and how it impacted me. I would then put myself back together and force myself to journey a few more years down the road of life. When something would happen in my life that led to a breakdown of my norms around me, I would turn inward and eventually delve deep into my mind to try to understand how and why the situation had developed. I can't claim to have always found some profound memory or experience in my earlier years that had led me to my present situation. In the end, though, there were some breakthroughs, and I'd be able to put my life back together a bit more complete than the time before. I'd become more stable, I'd grow, and develop more as a person, more into the person I wanted to become. The breakdowns became rarer and rarer, and I became fairly successful and stable, and reasonably adjusted as an adult. The success I experienced helped to hide a lot of the pain I felt from my past, but I still felt incomplete. Something buzzed in the back of my mind telling me that I hadn't truly healed yet. I managed to largely block out the growing fear and inherent danger building inside of my mind well into my adult years. Things would eventually come to a head when I was going through an especially stressful period at my work, a period that lasted for years. I was put in charge of two departments, one that was chronically understaffed and filled with a brutally demotivated and demoralized crew. My work had cut wages a few years ago, but kept promising that when things turned around we would all be rewarded for sticking out with them. The owner kept buying himself a new sports car every year. Inflation kept climbing, but everyone else was left with the wage freeze and hiring freeze. I loved the work I did, and I tried my best to deal with the situation. I was compensated well enough for serving two departments despite the previous wage cuts. I was able to pay my bills and survived at a semi-comfortable level. But I found myself working close to 70 to 80 hours a week for what amounted to a diminishing set of returns. My warehouse crew was repeatedly cut, and no wage increases for those who remained loyal. So the best and the brightest started to leave. This kept adding to my stress because I was told it was my job to figure it out and make sure the orders were picked and shipped on time. Fast forward another year, my tolerance for stress was virtually non-existent. I couldn't think straight, I couldn't remember things for very long, and I was becoming broken and lost. I hadn't mentioned it yet, but I am a husband and father to my wife's kids from a previous relationship. The relationship with my family at this point was near a tipping point. I was fighting frequently with my wife and unable to connect to my children. My wife was happy to have the money I brought in, but my work schedule kept me away a lot. The hardest part was frequently getting accused of cheating, when all I was trying to do was provide the best life I thought I could for my family. Originally, when I took over the two departments at my work, it was only to be a temporary change for around 6 months. As a buyer previously to accepting the role as the warehouse supervisor as well, the buying job was easily an 8-hour-a-day affair to look after properly, and the warehouse supervisor role was anywhere from 10 to 12-hour affair to do properly. I warned my boss when accepting the role that I could do it for a while, but not to expect either role to be up to normal standards. He told me not to worry about it, that he wasn't stupid and knew there would be inevitable consequences for both roles. I was told and promised that this would only be temporary, and that if I was successful at it, I'd get another promotion to operations manager. I worked both roles for the next 6 months, and when I would inquire about hiring a new buyer to allow me to focus on running the warehouse, I was unceremoniously informed that the role is now permanent, and that I would not be given any other support. The company wasn't making enough money to afford a buyer, and they felt I was handling both roles well enough. I said fine, but that I would need to be compensated adequately as it was no longer a temporary role, but a permanent change. My boss laughed in my face and told me he wished the same for himself, that there was no more money and I would have to make do. But don't worry, when the company returns to profitability, I'd still be eligible for promotion to operations manager. It was around this time that I realized he was absolutely full of shit and had no intentions of following through on any promotions. It was just the only carrot he had to dangle, or at least the only carrot he was willing to offer. I went out and got a job offer for a new company that could have potentially made a fair bit more money with less total investment of time. I didn't want to leave my current job. I truly loved the work I did. But I knew that things were going downhill, and I didn't see the upper management of the company as having the understanding or genuine desire to turn things around. When I turned in my notice, my boss came back to me with a counteroffer that was difficult to refuse. He offered me my own parking stall, a silly thing, but something I had asked for previously, that the company would pay for my cell phone as I was using it for work purposes already, and a $12,000 a year increase on my salary. The offer didn't match the potential I could make with the other company, but the salary was a guarantee, whereas the other job was largely built on piecework. If I accepted the offer, he promised me a bump in the warehouse crew size to help me deal with the workload. In the end, I accepted the offer. In a flagging economy, I would have been silly to turn it down. I was given an increase in the warehouse size for a time, so long as we kept hitting our monthly bonus criteria. I was still working close to 80 hours a week on average, but I was content. The money was good. My wife was happy. My kids had everything they needed and a few luxuries. Life was good. Another 6 months would pass, and as with all good things, they come to an end. Upper management had decided that the bonus criteria was too easily achievable. The bonus that was affected was basically an allotment of money that was allowed to be spent monthly on warehouse and delivery wages. If we kept the wages low enough compared to the sales dollars for the month, we were given just over a potential of $1,000. It wasn't an easy bonus to achieve, but I understood how to do the math for expected sales, and in just the hours I was allowed for my warehouse crew to work to be able to align with the same goal. I never allowed the workload to go unfinished, however, and would authorize overtime as required to balance the workload. Sometimes it means that I would still work 80 hours per week, try my best to balance the workload in allotted hours, and still come up short in the end and either get a partial bonus or nothing. It's very depressing to work your ass off and come up a few dollars over your allotment and get nothing but grief from your boss. He was on the same bonus structure as me. And then deal with the same from your wife when you got home. All the same, it did motivate me to work harder, smarter, and come up with more ways to make the warehouse run more efficiently. It became very common for my warehouse to hit the full bonus, even in the dead of winter when it was quite slow for sales. But, as I said, upper management decided that the criteria for hitting the bonuses was too easy. It was decided to reduce the threshold we allotted for warehouse and delivery wages by close to 25%. What this meant was that if we kept the warehouse and delivery crew totals where they were, we had zero chance of hitting another bonus. The sales dollar and required wage expenses to fulfill that level of work just did not match. My boss was very frustrated by this change, and so was I. We made honest efforts to show upper management the math doesn't work, that if we were to actually achieve those levels and numbers, it would severely impact customer service levels and wait times for work to be processed. We were told politely to take our concerns and shove them up our asses, to work harder and stop being lazy. It was around this time I reminded my boss the dual role was originally supposed to be temporary, and that I didn't feel I was being adequately compensated any longer for the required workload. I asked for a new buyer to be hired, and maybe if I was freed to focus fully on the warehouse side of things, perhaps I could manage just to get us back to hitting our bonuses. I was told it wasn't going to happen. The company had no money to afford a buyer and me. It was a polite hint that if push came to shove, things would not work out in my favor. Time goes on, though, as it's prone to doing, and my very experienced and loyal warehouse crew begins to start to unravel. Burnout is rampant, behavioral problems become extremely common. Some people start to leave, some become disillusioned, and find peace by doing the absolute bare minimum to keep from getting fired. This only further adds to my already crushing workload, but there's a twisted bright side to all this. Due to the reduced staff levels, customer wait times increase, work processes slower, and gradually customers start losing their patience and take their work elsewhere. This causes a reduction in total workload, leading to a painful equilibrium between work levels and staffing levels. My boss, however, still wants to hit the bonuses and forced me to readjust the hours my crew is allowed to work for the required workload. This results in even greater levels of burnout and resentment from the warehouse crew. We might hit a small bonus one month, but soon after, the crew productivity is so dank that we blow the numbers and miss all marks. It was a painful cycle to watch for the next 2 years. I would ask and beg for more crew and be denied. I would push myself to work as many hours as I could to try to make up for the shortfall and come up short in the end. All aspects of my own life suffered and began to deteriorate because of the overbearing stress from work. But fear not, the owner was still making enough bank to buy himself a new sports car every year. Hell, he even managed to build a multi-million-dollar home in this time. I have no idea how or why I managed to put up with the work conditions for as long as I did. I think for me it was the thought that this was my first big promotion. I was finally in management. I was making what felt like good money at the time, that I could finally afford to provide my family the life they deserved. In the end, I'm no machine. I began to break down and couldn't handle the stress anymore. My work finally started to see the differences in me and realized that a change was needed. I told my work I needed a buyer, or enough was going to be enough. I was soon informed that a change was indeed going to happen. I'd be returned to my previous position as a buyer with a hefty wage reduction, and then a new warehouse supervisor would be hired. I politely told my boss that would not be happening, that they could instead end our time together entirely and they could pay me out severance for ending my dual role. I was worried about what might come next, but I figured at least I finally understood what little worth all my time and energy had meant for the company. My willingness to walk away gave my boss pause, and we left the meeting without resolving things. On the following Monday, I was informed that a buyer would be hired instead, that I would train them, and then assume a full-time role as a warehouse supervisor. In the meantime, though, my boss had hired 2 new recruits for the warehouse. It was made clear that one of these recruits was originally offered the role as the warehouse supervisor, but my boss was not comfortable rescinding the offer for employment, instead brought the guy on as a regular member of the warehouse crew. I was not happy with this arrangement, but it was painfully clear that my replacement was lined up already if things didn't work out as my boss wanted. We don't get to choose all the details about our work, though, and sometimes have to try to make the most of a difficult situation. But things sometimes work out okay in the end. The new buyer was trained and put into his role a bit too early on his own, in my opinion, but such is how things happen. I took on the full-time role as the warehouse supervisor, with a reduction in total hours down to around 60 hours per week. I also had to accept a reduction in salary to go down to the single role, but I was relatively okay with that change for the reduction in stress. The stress reduction didn't last very long, though. The 2 new hires clashed with most of the warehouse crew, but I made an honest effort to try to incorporate them into the team. I could go on and on about all the troubles that happened between these 2 and the existing crew, but it's ultimately not needed. One of the hires left soon after starting, and the other made it a couple months. The one recruited to originally place me as a warehouse supervisor lasted longer than I did in the end, as the increased animosity of the warehouse crew and the still excessive workload finally broke me. My mental state was broken. I could no longer function. I couldn't remember details more than a few minutes. My bowels were a wreck, and I found myself visiting the restroom to expel my guts 5 or 6 times a day. The inexperience of the new buyer meant that I had to keep abandoning my warehouse duties to help with buyer-related stuff. I was constantly in this tug-of-war for my attention to both roles, with no support at work. If I complained, I was told I wasn't being a team player and was causing others to suffer. I ended up having a mental breakdown one day outside my wife's work when I was supposed to be going to my job. I had her join me outside in the parking lot and explain to her I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd reached my breaking point and didn't see any way forward anymore. I just wanted it all to end. I just wanted it all to end. I had her join me outside in the parking lot and explain to her I just couldn't do it anymore. I'd reached my breaking point and didn't see any way forward anymore. I just wanted it all to end, and I was thinking of how much better off I would be if I ceased to exist. Ultimately, I would visit my doctor and be put off work as an emotional injury. I was now involved in the process of a workplace injury claim, and one that my work tried to fight vehemently. In the end, though, I was able to successfully prove a claim of excessive workload and stress leading to my condition. It proved that my work had fostered the environment that led to my condition. I thought finally I can get some peace and begin to heal. I still hope to return to my job one day soon, but I needed time off to recover and regain my composure. Things didn't quite work out that way, though, as I began counseling and therapy for my condition. Details of exactly how things played out are a bit fuzzy for me, but I ultimately descended into painful and deep depression after being put off work. My home life was a wreck. My wife and children resented me being around. I was not a pleasant person to be around, and I was scared of the state of my life and how it was unraveling. It was around this time that the relationship with my wife also began to break down. Sex had virtually ceased to exist between us. Our communication largely consisted of fighting and resentment. I know there were times when she tried to be there for me, but I also came to terms with the truth that she wasn't and hadn't been kind to me in a long time. I began to realize that my wife had used sex against me for most of our relationship, and it was her preferred method of punishing me if she didn't get something she wanted in the relationship. Without work to tie up my mind for most of the day, I was largely left in my own head at home all day. I began working through my life and how I'd arrived at this point. My thoughts primarily centered around my wife and kids and how it seemed like nothing I had done up to this point had ever been good enough. I was pushed constantly to make more money for the family, and it was not to say that my wife didn't work hard at her job, but she strictly worked an 8-hour shift and wanted to be home at a decent hour. It was okay for me to push myself well beyond a 12-hour shift though, except when I started to want something in return. I wanted a peaceful life when I came home, but never got that. It was not uncommon to come home after a long shift just for my wife to insist to go back out so she can do some grocery shopping or something else. I would ask if we could please go on the weekend or a Friday night, so at least the work week was done. This wasn't good enough for her though, and either I did as she asked or she would make me pay. I would often get questioned why I was at work so late, despite her knowing about the workload I was under. I'd constantly, for most of our relationship, be accused of cheating on her. I never cheated on my wife, but she'd done it multiple times to me. Her accusation should have been the clue I needed to know that she either was still cheating or thinking about it. It upsets me immensely knowing that I broke my back and mind for her and her kids, and my reward is mistrust, anger, and lack of intimacy. Her greatest weapon against me was sex, and she would regularly withhold intimacy for 2, 3, 4 weeks or longer at a time. It seems to me on reflection that this was a very common theme throughout our entire relationship. She would finally relent with much protest when I would inevitably grow angry and frustrated with her, fighting sometimes for hours about the subject about a lack of intimacy between us. It became so common that the only reliable way I could get intimacy was after the inevitable big fight. I would then start to calm down after a few days of intimacy, and when she felt I was back to myself, she would shut down the intimacy again. It became so common that I eventually understood the pattern and could predict how exactly it would play out. To this day, I don't reliably know how she stopped cheating. To this day, I don't reliably know when she stopped cheating on me, but I should strongly suspect that it was a lot more frequent than she's ever admitted to. It's very hard to move on from being betrayed by your partner, even more so when it's done repeatedly, and to top it all off, the cheater constantly accuses you of doing the very thing they are guilty of instead. To this day, I don't know how to trust my wife anymore. I want to believe she's changed, that I am who she wants to be with. As I said though, without the pressure and time constraints of work on me anymore, I had a lot of time to think and get lost in my head. It was great at first. I was free to focus on my recovery and find peace with myself. But the more I examined my life, the more disillusioned I became with it as a whole. I realized that for at least the time being, work could no longer hurt me, but the pain I felt wasn't growing less. I began to closely examine the relationship I had with my wife and my children, and I realized I was deeply dissatisfied with it altogether. I have 2 girls, both in their mid and late teens at this time of period in my life. Neither of my children respected me. Listening to my instructions was rarely followed, and any time I tried to correct their behavior for the entire relationship, my wife would interfere and undermine me. I tried previously to explain to my wife how unfair the situation was. I was expected to provide for her and the kids, protect her and the kids, look after the house and all that entails, and still working a great deal of hours. And my reward was to come home to a messy house for the week, a cold meal that was prepared hours before. To top it all off, I knew if I knew I wasn't going to get laid if I said or took even one misstep that was of what she demanded the relationship be. I begged her to please back me up when I disciplined the kids. Instead, I was undercut and told to leave the kids alone. That I became too angry to deal with them and yelled too much. That I couldn't be trusted to discipline the kids. She's right. I did get angry and yell a lot. I never raised my hands to my kids, though. I didn't want my kids to equate violence with discipline like I had my mother. I would deal with the house trash, my kids' room an absolute mess, my own bedroom a mess of her clothes and makeup scattered everywhere. I had no sense of peace when I came home. I battled all day long at work and came home to more battling. Everything was a fight to get anything done. Eventually, I just largely checked out. It just wasn't worth the hassle anymore. I tried putting my time into video games, but was judged by my wife for spending all my spare time on gaming. This, despite the fact she knew I was a gamer before we ever got together, but I digress. Eventually, I became such an angry and hostile person that my wife would actually largely leave me in peace to play my games. Video games became one of my only avenues for escape from what life had become. In the end, though, my wife would become jealous of my time I spent on gaming and gave me the choice of the games or her. I did largely give up the gaming to focus on her instead. I don't regret that decision, and it had become an unhealthy obsession to cope with life. I put that energy back into work again, and despite giving up the gaming, my wife was still largely cold and unfriendly towards me. I'm glossing over many of fights we had over the gaming here. It's just a period of my life I don't have the energy or patience to recap accurately. The refocus on my work did allow me to advance my career though, getting promoted from the warehouse to a buying position, and eventually the dual role running the buying and warehouse departments. Each time the promotions came with a raise and an increase in the quality of life for my family. I'd often get rewarded by my wife with an increase in intimacy afterwards, but it was always fleeting. She'd grow used to the money and spending it and demand more. If I couldn't give more money, then I had to give more of my time doing the things she wanted. My life became an endless cycle of trying to please her and the kids, finding various degrees of success and failure, and ultimately losing sight of finding pleasure and peace for myself. All through the relationship, though, I knew something just didn't feel right. This isn't what life was supposed to be. I paint my wife in a fairly bad light, and I know I don't accurately show the abuse I forced her to suffer as well during the relationship. For a large part of the relationship, I was often quite angry and disappointed at myself and life in general. Oftentimes, me and my wife would get into various fights over the years, and I was quite vicious in my words and actions towards her. It's not to say she wasn't equally abusive in other ways, but I reigned as king of the insults and disrespectful tone. I'm largely recovered from this stage of my life, but there was a time where I would become explosive when angered. I knew this about myself, though, and would try to separate myself from the source of the conflict when I felt my blood starting to boil over. My wife, however, was not having any of that, and would literally barricade me in a room and continue her relentless talking about her issues and relationship problems. The talking by that point was just a back and forth of insults and accusations. The yelling from us both was brutal and inflicted lasting wounds on us both. I'd eventually find myself starting to lose control and try to force myself out of the room. My wife would block the door and refuse to move, afraid I might leave and never return, I guess, because the way she would panic when I tried to leave was often on the borderline to obsessive. Once in a while she might relent and let me leave, and I'd leave for a few and go for a drive for a few hours to clear my head. Oftentimes she would block the door and fight with me for all their strength to keep me there. Due to the physical abuse I've suffered in my past, I had a great deal of fear and frustration when I am confined against my will. I told my wife this, but it just didn't seem to matter to her. She was upset, and it didn't matter if we'd been fighting for hours. She was going to keep going until she got her way about whatever the fight was about. It was painfully unhealthy for us both to have gone through those experiences. It used to get so bad that I would literally have to pick her up and toss her onto the bed to get away from her. She'd sometimes get violent with me when moving her, and I got violent back. I'd shove her down and out of the way. One day after an especially ugly fight between us that turned violent, it just stopped. She stopped locking me in rooms to berate me endlessly, and I stopped flipping out and screaming at her. We both learned an important lesson about when to walk away and let each other cool off. I regret the violence that existed between us, but it happened, and that's the reality of the situation. Years would pass, though, and we settled into a more relaxed environment between ourselves, at least until I was put off work for my emotional injury. As I discussed, I had a lot of spare time on my hands. I spent most of it working through my mind and figuring out how I got to that point. I began to look at how my wife had treated me over the years and how she was treating me recently, and how I treated her. I recognized that I had been abusive to her at times, but I was finally starting to understand that her behavior towards me over the years was also abusive. The constant accusations of cheating, the general mistrust she showed me, and the lack of respect and acknowledgement for what I did for her and the family had ground me into dust, and I had virtually zero sense of self-worth. I tried to let work be my sense of accomplishment and place of peace, but it was a futile effort. My work was anything but peaceful. It was a horrendously toxic environment filled with angry and mistreated people. For better or worse, though, I often felt more peace while at work than I ever did in my own home. Now though that sense of peace, now though that sense of accomplishment was gone, that place that gave me some stability wasn't a part of my day-to-day life anymore. I came to realize that I had virtually no safe space in my life left to find peace. When I was home during the day while my kids were at school and work, and my wife was at work, I had the closest thing to peace I had experienced in years, and it was all so alien to me. It was greatly welcome, but the longer it went on, the longer I had time to reflect. My wife knew the torture I had endured at my job for her, but it became clear she was jealous of the fact that I was able to spend my days at home, and she still had to go to work. I think she tried to support me there into this time, but it felt forced. I guess I just didn't feel like she wanted to have to do it, that I should be better and get over it. My oldest daughter also worked at my job during this time as a warehouse worker. She'd been there for 2 or 3 years when I ended up breaking down. She suffered a lot of damage from the job as well, and would ultimately put off work by her own doctor for an emotional injury. After I was put off work, some of the more toxic warehouse workers had targeted her and inflicted abuse on her. I won't go into details, it's not my place to do that. But it's things that never should have happened, and were largely ignored by the employer. Her own mental health began to deteriorate, and she ended up joining me at the house too. My peace I had during the day largely went away, eventually going away entirely when my wife was also put off work to deal with me and her daughter. My memory was largely fragmented during this period, so I don't remember a lot of the details of the next few months. I know that eventually I grew very angry and frustrated with my wife and life in general. I started to lash out, and my wife returned the favor. Our sex life was virtually non-existent again, and I was reaching a breaking point. I descended even deeper into a depression, and just wanted so desperately to find peace in my life. I began to use a fair bit of weed and alcohol to cope with day-to-day life. I ended up on the internet searching for some kind of answer to how I had gotten to this point. Now I might find myself again. It was during the search that I learned a lot about common abuse that women do to men, especially women that have been physically or sexually abused by a previous partner. A lot of the actions of my wife began to make sense, as well as a lot of the actions my own mother had done to me so many years prior. My own mental state was also suffering more each day as I stripped away layer after layer of previously understood and accepted concepts of my reality. I finally was coming to terms that the treatment of my wife for these many years was not normal, that it had been abusive, that I too had been equally abusive towards her, and things needed to change. In previous fights with my wife, divorcing and going our own way always had come up. Each time my wife had threatened to go to my work and tell them how I abused her, to call my mother and tell her what a monster I was, and that she would tell every friend I had of all of her darkest secrets, that when she was done nobody would want to have anything to do with me, that she would destroy me if I left her, and that I'd have no one to blame for it but myself. I honestly don't know at what point in my breakdown I decided I needed to be away from my wife, but it was an extremely strong and feeling of certainty that it was the right decision. And despite my mental state being as fragile as it was, I knew that if I was going to leave, it had to be done carefully. One thing ended up leading to another, and I told my wife I wanted out. She told me everything we had accumulated. I told my wife I wanted out. She could keep everything we had accumulated in the relationship. I would take my share of the debt, and I would keep the car so I had somewhere to sleep if push came to shove, so I wouldn't be entirely homeless. All I wanted in return was freedom. I'd prepared myself for everything she could throw at me, every accusation she could make, every threat she could make. She threatened me with destruction of my career. I told her I don't think she can make it any worse, and to have at it if she wants. She threatened to call my mother and tell her everything going on. I offered my phone to make the call. Everything she tried, I just deflected and laughed in her face. I was done and wanted out. Then she hit me with her last and most painful attack. She told me she was about cheating on me, and it was with who had become my best and only friend. She told me it was a text conversation that happened 10 years prior, where she and he agreed that they wanted to sleep with each other. I admit it hurt immensely to hear that, but I wasn't without some preparation for a possible revelation of further cheating on her part. I just didn't expect to have been with my friend. It's just what some women do. My friend confirms the conversation took place, but he blames her for initiating it, and that she basically asked if he'd sleep with her, and he agreed he would. He claims it ended there and nothing happened. Maybe that's the truth, but it doesn't matter. It was cheating, another betrayal, and one she held on to for 10 years, and only chose me to tell me about it to hurt me when I was prepared to walk away. I should have left that day. I wanted to leave, but something had melted away inside of me. I just lost all fear. I had zero fear of anything. I was absolutely broken, but I was okay with it. I knew I wasn't okay, mind you. I just was okay with not being okay finally. This lack of fear allowed me to delve deep into my mind and start to dissect all the years of trauma I had endured. I kept digging deeper and deeper, seeking a resolution to some unknown problem that was still plaguing me. I think my wife took me not leaving as some sign that I wanted to work things out. Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't. Something was happening to me though, and I had to find the truth out. I was excited at my newfound lack of fear, and my mind became sharp and focused again. Then my mind began to run away with thoughts and emotions so fast I could barely process them. Before I was on to an entirely different thought process from the last. It was immensely exciting and a bit unsettling. I felt that I was finally truly connecting with myself, that life had thrown all it had at me, and it had failed to break me. That despite all the best efforts of my wife, she had no more power over me, and I was truly free for the first time in my life. Doctors would later tell me that I was experiencing a manic state of a bipolar disorder, that I had managed to make it almost 40 years of age without diagnosis, that I should take this huge assortment of pills to help me cope and get back to a state of balance. But that's jumping a bit ahead. I wasn't done with my phase of self-discovery and learning to understand myself, and I had gotten to the point I was at. Around this time of dropping all my fear, my wife turned to using her body to try to control me. After a largely sexless marriage of 14 years, she threw herself at me constantly. Anytime I asked, I received. I realized during this time exactly how to behave to get my wife into the mood, and it became a game to entice her to bed. It was great for a week or so, until I realized what I was actually doing. The excitement of the easy intimacy faded away, and I began to think of how I was manipulating my wife for my pleasure. I also began to understand that for better or worse, it was just regular intimacy. My wife was nothing special in bed, that I could receive this from any woman. I think my wife also realized herself around this point what was happening, and we both withdrew from each other. I descended further down the rabbit hole that was my mind, and began to find things I did not like. Somewhere during this time, my wife had moved out with her kids to stay at her mom's place nearby, and I was finally free to fully delve deep into my thoughts. The biggest revelation of my life came up when I had asked my wife to come visit me. I guess I was feeling a bit lonely and wanted intimacy with her. I don't recall if we were intimate, but I recall being in the bath with her sitting nearby talking to me. She had said something that triggered something in me, and I didn't understand what it was or what was happening. I started to feel something bubbling up in me that was just terrifying, and that might have been why I wanted her to be there with me. The only way to describe what I felt coming up is to pretend you have an ugly wound, infected and pussing badly. Now imagine somehow a layer of skin has managed to grow over this infection, locking it in, and then being hidden by the skin, and then new wounds grow on top of it, and are finally covered with a bandage. The experience I went through that night was like ripping off this bandage along with the healed skin, just to expose this long-forgotten infection that had been slowly eating everything around it. The sense of dread and fear that washed up for me as I began to experience the unblocking this long dormant memory is beyond my ability to put into words accurately. I just knew that something foul was about to come out of me, and I had to be alone. I tried my best to explain to my wife that I needed her to leave and needed her to go now. I probably scared her a great deal that night, and she tells me I ended up shoving her out of the house. I don't remember that part. The rest of that night is largely a blur. However, I'd started to record myself on my phone to help me remember things. My memory had become extremely short and unstable, oftentimes losing the ability to recall thoughts I was having just a few moments prior. I ended up recording to myself a message about the trauma that revealed itself that night. I unblocked a set of memories from the time I was around 2 until about 4 or 5 years old. It was the memories of my mother sexually abusing me and the details of what she used to do to me. I won't torment anyone with the full details of what I had uncovered, but it did finally let me see and understand why that horrendous infection had existed for so long in my mind. I've had people since this episode experience tell me that I imagine things, that what I believed happened to me is just not realistic, that because I was in a manic state of a bipolar episode, I made it all up. I wish they were right. I wish the image I had of my mother was not shattered by this revelation. It's a tragic thing to go through life believing your mother is the one and only person you can trust to always have your back, only to realize she's instead a root, if not the root cause, of all the horrors you've experienced as a child and later as an adult. I struggle often with the memories replaying through my mind as if on repeat. Even during the mental breakdown of my memory issues, that stuck with me through it all. I also unlocked a memory of a time in the car with my mother, and her extremely angry with me. I was around 8 or 9 at the time. It's my best guess anyways. We were driving towards the city from home for something. And in a fit of anger, she told me she didn't know why she just doesn't steer the car off the road and smash us into a tree, killing us both. I never trusted riding in the car with my mother again after that, but I didn't understand why I was so afraid of a random car crash ending up in a tree. The fear of the crash lived on, but the source of where it came from blocked out for years and years. Despite all the trauma my mother inflicted on me, I try not to hate her. Abusers were often a victim of someone else, but it does not excuse the victim from the own horrors that they choose to visit on others in their lives. We are all victims in one form or another in this life, but we must choose to do better, to break the cycle. There is a way forward that leads to peace and salvation, no matter how dark the path forward may look. Ultimately, my mental breakdown will lead me to being put into a hospital against my will. I'm still deeply resentful for having my freedom stolen from me. When I was taken in, I was an absolute wreck. I destroyed my house. I was not taking care of myself very well. I was in a state of deep depression and suffering. Despite that reality, I was choosing to find a way forward. I wanted to exist and to find peace in my life. I loved myself for the first time in a long time. I finally understood where a lot of my most difficult memories and experiences stemmed from. I felt that life had finally exhausted all the horrors it could visit upon me, and I was utterly without fear now of the future. The crushing dread I experienced the night of my greatest breakthrough of my suppressed memories was gone. In its place, I felt the spark of joy and hopefulness returning to me. My visit in the hospital forced me to come to terms with the fact that the way I was acting was very strange and abnormal for those around me. I was completely open with those around me, and I could connect immediately with people in a way that I had never experienced in my life. When I say I was without fear, I mean it. I wasn't afraid of being hurt anymore. The loss of fear of being hurt is a powerful sensation. Maybe having a bit of fear is a good thing, to help protect us from those who aren't deserving of opening up to. But I hope that fear never stops me from opening up to someone truly deserving in the future. My stay in the hospital drove fear back into me, though. I wanted my freedom back. I wanted to be free to fix my life and move forward. The doctors in charge of me made clear that I was acting abnormally and that they did not feel I could be trusted to not be a threat to myself or others. I made it a point to connect with as many people in my first weeks in the hospital, to inquire why they were in the hospital themselves and find common ground with them. I was hungry for true human connection, and I loved it. I'm not saying I didn't encounter those suffering, some with equally painful stories to share as my own, but it was one of the most meaningful experiences of my life to connect and give a damn about these people, especially when it became painfully clear how little some of the doctors and nurses cared about their patients. It's painful to know the mistreatment the mentally ill must endure due to people not understanding how someone got to the state they are at. I cried a lot at first at the hospital, especially when it came time to meet with the doctors who ultimately decided when I could leave that place. I would tell them openly about what had led me to my current state. I made it a point to be painfully honest about what I had endured from my mother, sister, and later in life the abuses me and my wife put each other through. I felt that being honest about what I was experiencing and enduring would be the best option. I was given a ton of pills and given various diagnoses of mental illnesses. I saw that I was too unstable to be released, that I was unsettling to people in my current state, that I was viewed as a danger. It was deeply hurtful to be told this, when in my core I felt the complete opposite. I was no harm to anyone, especially not myself. I just wanted to feel love and spread love. I wanted everyone around me to know they mattered, that they mattered because we all hurt, that this was the core binding us all together as humans, and they are not alone in their pain. While I felt utterly without fear, I wasn't without pain. But my stay in that place gradually began to change me. I developed fear of the loss of my freedom. I got to hear the horror stories of some of the patients having been locked away in this ward for years, left to largely descend into their own personal hells without recourse or hope of a better future. I'm rational enough to realize that some of these patients absolutely were where they needed to be, but I was also rational enough to realize that some of the doctors did not need to be in charge of these patients anymore. I was rational enough to realize that no amount of my protesting being there was going to change anything. If I acted out at the loss of my freedom, it would only result in a longer stay. I had to submit to that fear of the loss of my freedom to regain it again. I had to slowly kill off the person who was open to the world, who was without fear of it. I had to bottle up the person who I had to become to survive the greatest war I'd ever had to face. It was like slowly losing yourself to gain back just a hollow shell. I know I was not okay, but it's okay sometimes to not be okay. I was confronting horrible trauma and betrayal from the two most important women in my life, my wife and my mother. I was absolutely a wreck, but I was coping with the trauma the only way I knew how to. My wife visited me in the hospital often, and we were able to get me a laptop we could communicate via Skype. We even played an old text-based game that we used to play together years prior. It was my only source of connection to my previous life while I was locked away in that place. My desire to be free of my wife gradually went away, and I reconnected to her for that sense of comfort and normalcy. I don't know if we'd still be together today if it had not been put into the hospital. I think about it sometimes, and I wonder if it's the right path for me forward or not. I look at my wife and I see all the things I want us to be together, and then I remember the betrayals and I question why I think it'll be different this time. I tell myself her betrayals are 10 years in the past, but I find myself having an extremely hard time trusting her. I fear connecting to her in a meaningful way, afraid that she'll expose yet another betrayal or lie that she's been hiding for years or weeks. I'm confused as to why she was there through my time in the hospital. Does she truly love me and sees finally the pain she put me through was unfair all these years? I don't know. I don't know that answer. I find myself at a crossroads now, trying to decide the path I want my life to take. It's been 2 years since I was in the hospital now. My wife and I are fighting a lot lately. Sometimes it's good for a few days, then we backslide again. While I try to sort out whether I should be with her, I'll work on myself. I'll eat better, I'll get healthy and fit at the gym, and I'll try to work on finding a job that I can find some fulfillment at. I'm also going to post on YouTube, as long as they'll let me. I'm going to work primarily on comedy and storytelling material to put up. I want to bring joy to people and a few laughs. I'll be the first to admit though that material will be dark humor in nature, but that's okay. In comedy, nothing is off limits. You just have to not be afraid and speak with conviction. Thanks for listening.